Thank you all for joining us tonight for our RiverWatch Fall Speaker Series. For those of you who are not familiar with the Illinois RiverWatch Network, RiverWatch is a community science organization that trains volunteers to monitor water quality in their own communities. The mission of RiverWatch is to safeguard the future of Illinois rivers and streams through stewardship, education, and sound science. Before we get started, I ask that you keep your microphones muted during the presentation. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so if you have any questions along the way, you can either put them into the chat box or you can save them and ask them aloud at the end. Now I would like to welcome our presenter tonight, Jessica Mohlman. Jessica is a research coordinator and assistant scientist at National Great Rivers Research and Education Center. She oversees NGREC's remarkable crew of research specialists and field technicians, coordinates research and facilitates safety trainings, and has a research allotment focused on wildlife ecology. For the last 4 years, her research has mainly focused on the state-threatened bird-voiced treefrog, which will be discussed today. Prior to her current role, she was a research specialist at NGREC and previously worked as a mammals research assistant at the Field Museum of Chicago. She serves on the Illinois Amphibian Reptile Endangered Species Technical Advisory Committee, and she's also the co-coordinator for the St. Louis Area Frog Watch chapter. And with that, I would like to welcome Jessica Mohlman.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannah. So I'm really excited to be here with you all tonight. I brought the swamp to you all. So this is actually a picture of Southern Illinois behind me. I do currently have my dog sleeping in here, and hopefully he will remain behaved this evening. But if you hear a dog barking, I'll make sure I move him out quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share our presentation for the evening. All right. So today's talk is going to be preserving the song of the Illinois Bayou, conservation efforts for the bird-voiced treefrog. So Hannah gave a little overview. I know not all the time when we are involved with RiverWatch do we know the connection between RiverWatch and NGREC, or the National Great Rivers Research and Education Center. So NGREC is what houses Illinois RiverWatch, and what I and Hannah and Danielle, who are in charge of RiverWatch, are all staff members of. So NGREC is a leader in freshwater research, education, and conservation outreach programs that advance knowledge and improves land and water management practices, guides policies related to great rivers and their floodplain system, and watersheds for the benefit of human and ecological communities. So that's a mouthful, but essentially we are a water ecology research center. Then we also work with the Great River systems, but then also those lands that feed them, which is going to come into play with our talk tonight regarding wetlands and then treefrogs that utilize those areas. Before I get into really speaking about the research, I definitely need to bring up my team of amazing research specialists, field technicians, and interns in the past, as well as unphotographed current volunteers with our programs that have helped. This research, as you're going to see, takes a lot of on-the-ground efforts. We have at least 3 to 4 people who go out with us every single trip when we go out, because we're checking a lot of traps that we're going to be going over. So over the last few years, at a minimum, I've had Melissa Schindler, Jen Hemphill, Amy Janik, John Connick, Mackenzie Fisher, Bill Stamper, Leslie Gittmeyer, Catherine Nguyen, Brooke Prater, Andrew Wilk, and Trent Alphen help with these projects, along with many other people who have been able to come out once or twice with us. So who are we talking about tonight, or what are we talking about? It is the bird-voiced treefrog, and adequately named, it tends to sound like a bird, and a lot of people mistake it as a bird when they're out in the field. So bird-voiced treefrogs are state-threatened in Illinois, and they're very understudied throughout their range. And they also are pretty cryptic, and they can change color with both temperature and their surroundings. So those pictures in the top corner, those are all bird-voiced treefrogs. They are all just different colors due to their surroundings or whatever temperature it was. And really this hind leg that is this iridescent green is what we're looking at when we're trying to identify the species when we have it in hand. Other than that, we can identify it by its call. It also looks very similar to a gray treefrog, or the gray treefrog complex species, which we're going to talk about in the future. And that's something that you probably see around your homes, whether you're in northern Illinois, more around the Alton area. They're a lot more common of a species. So these bird-voiced treefrogs are found in southern Illinois. as where their permanent habitat range is. And that is because of the fact that they are habitat specialists. We'll go into a little bit more detail about what that means in a little bit. However, it just means that they have very specific habitat needs, and that is really confined to these bald cypress tupelo swamps that we find in southern Illinois that look very similar to if you were in Florida or Georgia. And the northernmost range of those swamps is southern Illinois around the Shawnee National Forest and the Cache River system. So before we go into a lot of that, what exactly is a swamp? Well, a swamp is a type of wetland that is wooded and is at least partially flooded with water most of the year. Once again, people tend to think of swamps purely being in the southeast that looks something like this, where actually these photos were both taken in southern Illinois. So there are sites that look like this in Illinois. And before I started working on this project with EGREC 4 years ago, growing up in northern Illinois, I didn't even know that we had swamps that looked like this in the state. What is a wetland? Very, very simply, a wetland is wet land. It is a place that is covered by water either seasonally or permanently. And why are they important? This all leads into why we care about these species in the first place. Why should we care about protecting bald cypress, these bird voice tree frogs, and their habitats? So wetlands are important very broadly because they can be thought of as Earth's kidneys. So they help filter out pollutants that are in the water systems. They're nature's sponges. So a lot of times we see now, especially in urban areas, when we have these dramatic rainfall events, there's a lot of flooding that's occurring because we don't have these wetlands around. It's just all of this concrete. All this water comes down, it has no place to go. We have these traumatic flood events where if we had more wetlands in the area, that would help absorb all this runoff that we're seeing. And then they're also extremely diverse ecosystems as far as both plants and animals are concerned. So what does this have to do with frogs? Well, frogs have semi-permeable skin, and that's designed to transfer oxygen and water through it. Essentially, they can sort of breathe through their skin. And this makes it really easy for them to be able to absorb pollutants and chemicals. Because they can absorb these pollutants, a lot of times frogs can be thought of this canary in the coal mine. So they can be a great indicator of something is going wrong in a habitat before maybe we know about it, because they're either there or they're not there because of the fact that they can't tolerate pollution. And this is so important to them, not also because of their skin, but because both of their life cycles require them being in water, whether it's when they're in their egg stage, tadpole, their little froglet, we call it, when they have all of their legs, but they still have their tail, and when they're adult frogs. So bringing it back to why do we care about bird voice tree frogs and their habitats? So I mentioned that they are state threatened in Illinois, and they've been state threatened since 1999. They're understudied species not only in Illinois, but throughout their entire range. Their habitats that they live in, these wetlands in southern Illinois, these bald cypress swamps, are wetlands of international importance, not just states, not just at a national level, but at a global international level. And 90% of Illinois' original wetlands have been lost. And this is because a lot of them were gotten rid of in the 70s, 80s, because people didn't know of their use, that they're these natural sponges, that there's these filterers. They saw them as a place that was kind of smelly, had lots of mosquitoes, and just really wasn't that pretty. And they decided that, these were habitats that we could get rid of, make way for agriculture or any other building. So sadly, we've lost about 90% or more in Illinois. And they're also very cute, as we'll see throughout the presentation, but I might be a little biased there. So broad overview of previous work in Illinois on the bird voice tree frog. As I mentioned, they've been on the list since 1999, and a lot of this previous work was really in the 1990s by an individual named Michael Redmer, but these were all auditory and visual surveys. So these surveys didn't really ever have the frog in hand, and it's really difficult to get a good idea about what a population number is when you're just trying to listen for those frogs or get a visual survey, especially when these individuals are so cryptic and can blend in so well with their environment. However, his research did lead to the species being listed in 1999 in Illinois, and as I mentioned, it has been on the list to this day. And then in 2016, Illinois, along with many other states, went through having wildlife action plans where we denoted species of greatest conservation need, habitats of greatest conservation need. And this was one of the species and habitat areas that was marked by the state, by the Department of Natural Resources, that they wanted to have more insight into. So in 2016, after that, NREC started working on bird voice tree frogs by doing a herptile assessment, or looking at all the amphibians and reptiles that were in these areas in southern Illinois. And during that research is when they found habitats that had bird voice tree frog. And that's when our project started looking at their population demography in 2020. And that research has continued today. There has been additional research throughout the time, but these are kind of some more core research that has occurred specifically in the state and ones that have hands-on experience with these bird voice tree frogs. So looking at NREC's work, we started looking at the population demography of bird voice tree frogs. And that's looking at essentially 4 different things. So 1, how many? That's when we're getting at these population estimates, or how large the population of bird voice tree frogs are. 2, what does the population look like? That's these demographics. That is, if there's males, females, adults, juveniles, what basically does the structure of that habitat look like? Because if we only have a bunch of males, or we only have a bunch of females, we only have adults and no juveniles, there's no way for that population to be sustainable or continue growing. How are they doing? So we want to do a status assessment to see, does this species still need to be on the threatened list? Does it need to be escalated to being endangered? Or can it be maybe taken off the list because people just didn't really know about it in the past? And then what does their habitat look like? So really get into the hydrologic, so the water presence at these swamp sites, and then the habitat data such as, what does the tree makeup, what does the understory makeup of these sites look like? So we had 2 broad expected outcomes for this research. One, as I mentioned, is the species status assessment. So updating those population numbers and demographic data so we can provide information to the state of Illinois for their threatened species list, so we can know, does this need to be escalated to being endangered? Can it maybe be taken off of the list? Because it's very difficult for us to be able to make conservation decisions on a species if we really just don't know that much about it. And can it be used as a possible bioindicator? So when I was talking about wetlands and how frogs are important in these habitats a few slides back, I brought up that they have this semi-permeable skin that makes them very susceptible to pollution. So can we use them to basically know how a habitat is doing? Specifically in the Cache River system, which I'll show you a little bit on a map here shortly, where some of our sites are at, they've been undergoing restoration for about the past 20 years. And they're trying to restore these wetlands to these really pristine bottomland forest swamps. And we're trying to see, are those restoration of efforts being effective? Are they actually bringing back in species that require high quality habitat? And could we use bird voice tree frogs as an indicator of the success of this restoration work? So our study areas. So this is in the very, very southern Illinois. It's a little hard to see down there, but we're all the way at the bottom in Shawnee National Forest, near the tip by Kentucky. We have 10 sites that we are looking at. The 7 that are highlighted in this box currently are in the Cache River system. And then these 3 that are over to the side are in the eastern Shawnee National Forest. The fact of why they're not even for Cache River in eastern Shawnee is just the fact that a lot of times it can be very difficult to get permits, especially on national forest property. So that's the factor of why there's not that even distribution there. And we have 3 broad habitat structures. So we have first this pristine kind of site structure, which is closed canopy, so there's not a lot of sun showing through. It's seasonally floods, so we will see that, I'm going to be going out into the field next week. It should be fully dry at these sites now, but in the spring, when there's that snow melt coming off from the winter, that's when the water is the highest. And then it's dominated by these bulb cypress and tupelo trees. And the reason that those sites are dominated by bald cypress and tupelo trees are those trees need to have seasonal drying in order for their saplings or the baby trees to be able to live. If a place is permanently flooded, those trees cannot survive. And you might see some of these bald cypress there, but they're probably very, very old that were there before it became inundated and didn't dry out anymore. Then we have these semi-degraded sites, which are semi-closed canopy, semi-permanent flooding. So they will dry a little bit, but then usually in the middle of the swamp, there is some water that stays year-round. And then they do have some bald cypress and tupelo, but not as much since it doesn't fully dry. And then we have these chaotic sites that are on the farthest right, and these are our degraded sites. These are open canopy, they're permanently flooded, these are never drying. These are the ones that when we go out in the spring and the water's the highest, we actually have to wear waders out to them because the water might be up to our hips. And there's very few bald cypress or tupelo trees. The ones that are there are ones that are historic, probably very, very old before there was some land use changes around these swamps that required them to become fully permanently flooded. So how do we trap tree frogs? Using really high-tech science in PVC pipes. Traditionally, how individuals trap frogs or other amphibians and reptiles is something called a drift fence. And this is something that would go up to about your knee, and it would be lining a wetland, and individuals would come up to that fence. They would be like, oh, I can't go any farther. They would slither along or hop along, and then they'd fall into a bucket, and we would check that bucket all the time to be able to know what species were there. But when we have individuals like tree frogs that can climb, those individuals would just climb right over those fences. So, in the past, surveys weren't catching these tree frogs because it wasn't sufficient, sampling methods. So individuals came up with this PVC pipe design, and we call it a trap, but really the individuals are not actively trapped in there. It's what's called a passive trap. So we see that there is that opening at the top of the PVC pipe that is always open, so the frogs are welcome to come and go as they please, but it allows it to fill up with water to that first collar, so it creates this nice dark, damp environment that the tree frogs like. But they're not actively trapped in there. They can come and go as they please. So when we sample down there every couple of weeks, we're just seeing what's in there at that time and might not get everything that necessarily goes through that trap. And this is another diagram of how you make those traps. Something additional that gets added into traps where there's a lot of mammals also in those habitats is they'll put a little paracord or a little what they call rescue rope inside so that if a flying squirrel or a small shrew or anything gets inside the trap, since they don't have suction cup hands, they're able to grab onto that rope and climb out. We also get a lot of other seasonal visitors into these traps. Wasps like making nests in them. We get slugs. A lot of frogs like hanging out with giant wolf spiders. It's always interesting to see what you're going to find in that trap, in addition to a tree frog when you go around and check them. So our experimental design, all of our traps are placed roughly 3 meters apart. And we have 50 traps at 10 sites. So we have 500 traps that we are checking every single time we go out. So as I mentioned, this is a very field intensive, a lot of boots on the ground when we're doing this. That's why I have all those people in the beginning of the presentation that I thanked, because every single time we go out there, we are checking 10 sites with 500 traps. And we do it in about 3 days every single time. So that's a lot of ground to cover. At these sites, we have roughly 2 transects or 2 blocks, however you'd like to think of it. Traps 1 through 25 are kind of in this block shape where the first half of the traps are kind of that inner portion of the wetland where we're really walking through the water if it is a flooded time period. And the other half are like lining the wetland. So usually those are not in the water. And then our other transect is then 26 through 50 in a similar fashion where we have some of the traps are in that inner portion of the wetland and the other traps are in that outer portion just lining the wetland. So we open these traps in March And we're not sampling them right away when we're in March. We take a cap off, and that allows the trap to fill back up with water, allows the frogs in the area to become more familiar again with the fact that these traps are there. And then we start sampling April through October. During April through May, we're sampling every 2 weeks or bi-monthly. And then nowadays we are not sampling in the summer, and I'll get to why we're not doing that shortly. And then we close the traps October to November. And how we do that is either by placing a cap on top of the PVC, or we also sometimes flip them over so that basically nothing can get trapped in the bottom. And we just want to make sure that none of the frogs are using those as their torpor sites or their hibernation sites for the winter, because they could become so cold that they would fall down into the ice and freeze, and that isn't great for all of them. Or if anything else were to get trapped in there during the winter, we just want to seal it up to make sure nothing gets in there that we do not want. So we're actually going next week, Monday through Wednesday. We're going to be checking the traps for a final time and closing them for the season. It's always interesting to see how seasons and years change. Last year when we went out, there was frost on the ground. It was very cold. It was like in the 30s, and it looks like it's supposed to be back up into the 80s next week when we go again. But we will still be closing them just because, just keep with consistency of the years of data. So back again, we have bi-monthly sampling March through May, monthly to no sampling through the summertime. When we had our DNR grant running, which is not currently running anymore, and I'll discuss that a little bit in the future. We went out in the summer to sample, but we only did it monthly. And this is because those summer seasons, those summer months, is when the frogs are breeding. So we get very few individuals in our traps because they're all out in the middle of the swamp breeding. And it's one of those things where you have to balance kind of just how much money and time it takes to get down there for what you're getting and yielding in the data that you're getting. So we found the last 2 years not going out in the summertime has really not made much of a statistical difference and the information that we get, just because we would go out and, in 500 traps catch maybe less than 20 frogs during that time because they're all breeding. And then back to bi-monthly sampling, August through October, and then closing somewhere between the last week of October, first week of November, depending on the weather. So other species that we collect when we're out there are the green tree frog and then gray tree frog complex. So this includes both the gray tree frog and then the Cope's gray tree frog. If you've not heard, there are 2 different species. This happens a lot in the Midwest region. The species look exactly the same. It is a chromosomal or DNA difference in the individuals, and at very specific temperatures, they do have a different call. However, it's very hard for somebody by ear to hear this difference. It's something that an audio recorder would be able to pick up. So, for our study, it doesn't really matter to us if they're Cope's or they're gray tree frog. So we just consider that the complex. And back to generalists versus specialists. So a generalist are the species like gray and green tree frogs that we collect. So what that means is they are found in these swamps, but they're also found elsewhere. So specifically, green and gray tree frogs, you might find those in your backyard. Green, if you're in southern Illinois, they are starting to get to the St. Louis area, but gray tree frogs are found all the way up into Wisconsin. So if you find a tree frog in your area, you likely are finding a gray tree frog, even though it's very rarely actually gray. So they can also be anywhere from green to gray to brown or some combination of that, because they also can change color with their temperature. But they actually have, how we tell the difference between them and bird voice is they have this vibrant orange between their legs when the bird voice have that iridescent green. So to recap, generalists are found in the swamps, but they can be found elsewhere as well, and they have less specific habitat needs. So, they can be found in backyards. You might find them in a retention pond, where specialists, such as the bird voice tree frog, they are mostly found in these swamps because they are intolerant to permanently flooded conditions. We're going to find them in the swamps that are more dominated by those bald cypress and tupelo because those seasonally flood, or they mostly recede during the winter season, not those permanently flooded habitats, and they have specific habitat needs. So how do we go about catching these individuals? What do we do with them when we catch them? So we first check the traps and we gather habitat data such as temperature, humidity, and dew point. We check to see if they are a recapture by using a scanner on them. And if they're not a recapture, they go under anesthesia, which is actually an Oragel solution. Yes, Oragel like you use on your mouth if you have a sore tooth. The main ingredient in Oragel is benzocaine, and benzocaine is an anesthetic. And it's been shown that in both salamanders and frog species that Oragel is an efficient substitute for using straight benzocaine. And it's a lot easier for individuals to be able to get a hold of, a lot cheaper, more cost effective, and a lot easier to travel with because you don't have to do some back-end chemistry with it. So we do use Oragel in a mixture of water. They go in there, they get a nice bath, they get sleepy, and it allows us to be able to more safely handle them and prepare them for a administration of a tag, which I'll get to in a moment. So we figure out how long they are and how much they weigh. If it's a male, female, adult, or juvenile, and its species ID. So if it's a bird voice tree frog, a green tree frog, or a gray tree frog. And then if it was not a recapture after it has gone under its anesthesia, we give it what's called a PIT tag, which stands for passive integrative transponder. And this is very similar to what your cat or your dog would get at the vet. So you know if they would lose them, you bring them to the vet, they scan them with a scanner, and it gives a unique ID, which then tells them who their owner is. So this is similar for frogs, though it's much smaller. It is about the size of a grain of rice for them. But we administer this tag between their skin. So it's not going into any organs or anything like that. And they do shed it out eventually because frogs do shed their skin. And it has a unique ID on it. And once we're done administering that tag, they go back into some water that allows them to recover, and then we release them. And this has been found to be very successful in tree frogs and many other species utilize pit tags. And it's extremely important to do this because if we were to go up to, say, a tree and catch a frog 10 different times and it didn't have any sort of marker on it or tag or anything like that, we might think that that is 10 different frogs that we were catching, where maybe it's just one frog that really, really likes that tree. And when we're looking at a species that's state threatened, that's really important for us to get correct numbers of how many frogs are out there and not skew the population potentially because we didn't know who that was exactly. And it's also extremely important because it helps us get a better idea of how long these individuals live, how they grow, how they move. We're able to see how they move about their habitat based on what traps we catch them at. But then they have that unique ID as well. So some summary statistics. This is all based on last season. So we're going to be finishing up this season next week. And I don't have the data analyzed from this year yet, but this is some basic summary stats. So how many frogs have we caught in the first 3 years of this study? So we caught total captures, 1,135 bird voice tree frogs, 464 green tree frogs, and 556 gray tree frogs. And that is total capture. So once again, I'm talking about, the importance of these pit tags. We might think that we caught 1,135 frogs and that's how many are there. Or in reality, that was 430 unique individuals we caught. So it means that some of those individual bird voice tree frogs we were catching multiple times. So uniquely, we caught 430 bird voice tree frogs, 275 green tree frogs, and 251. But this is still great to see because we're catching more of the species that we're looking for, this habitat specialist, this bird voice tree frog, and less of the generalist species. So it's very exciting to see that we are catching more of what we are looking for. So looking at the different COAs, so I mentioned we had that block where it was like, these are the ones that are in Cache River, these are the ones that are in Eastern Shawnee. That is what a conservation opportunity area or COA is for here. So those restored habitats in Cache River system, this is what we caught there. We caught 473 total bird voice tree frogs, 291 green, and 378 gray. And then at the historic site, those Shawnee National Forest sites that haven't been touched, 662 bird voiced, 173 green, and 178 gray. And you can really see looking at all of these sites here, so I'm not expecting you to gather too much from this, but just really seeing kind of how a few of these sites specifically are really driving up those numbers for the species that we're seeing. And one of the sites, this first one on this diagram, we actually didn't even catch anything other than a couple gray tree frogs. And this shows also the importance of long-term data monitoring, because the first 3 years of this study, this first site here, this BCS, Big Cypress Swamp, we didn't catch any bird voice tree frog there. We didn't catch any gray tree frog there. Now we have actually caught bird voice tree frogs there, and we've caught green tree frogs, and we've caught way more gray tree frogs there. And we never saw them the first 3 years, but now we're seeing them. So summary statistics just of the bird voice tree frog. So we had 16 females, 352 males, and 63 unknown. And you might be wondering, what the heck were the females? And that is a good question. So they do not call, and they are more secretive in general, especially outside of breeding season. You're likely only really going to see them the most when they're coming down for breeding season. So, it might just be that they're more secretive. Perhaps they're more high up in the canopy. Maybe they're farther out from the swamp unless it is breeding season. We need to figure out a better way to be able to account for these females since we're not able to find them. But we know that they're there because we're catching juveniles. We're seeing a lot of species. We're seeing a lot of frogs. So we know that breeding is occurring when frogs are being born. We're just not getting those females in hand, and we have to figure out a better way to kind of account for those individuals. And how do we tell them apart though? So males, during the breeding season, they have a vocal pouch because they're the ones that call. And they also have this enlarged thumb pad that I highlighted right here. It's a little hard to see. But then females, they don't have that enlarged thumb pad. They don't have vocal pouches. So that seems like that should be pretty easy to tell the difference between them. However, when it is not breeding season, which is most of the time that we're sampling these individuals, they start to absorb their vocal pouch and they'll even absorb that thumb pad. So it becomes very difficult to sex them. And a lot of times we have to put this unknown over here. And that is either one, that it's a time in the breeding season or a time in their season where it's very hard to sex them at all, or it's because those individuals were just too young to have those sexual characteristics yet. So it could be that a lot of these unknowns, we caught the 63 unknowns, maybe some of those are females and they just didn't have those characteristics for us to see at that time. And that's something we're able to go back and double check. So if we catch an unknown, again, during the breeding season, and it really has those definite, vocal pouches and those enlarged thumbs, we can go back in the data set and kind of back correct, because if it was an unknown and now it is a male and it definitely has male characteristics, we're able to go back and correct that because we have those pit tags in them that has that unique ID. And then age, we have caught 368 adults, and adults are greater than or equal to 31 millimeters in length. And then juveniles are, we've caught 81 of those as of last season, and those are 30 millimeters or less. And we have a really wide range of individuals that were catch. So the smallest one as of last season we ever caught was 14 millimeters, and the largest was 57 millimeters. And this is one of those tiny guys right there. There's a little screw next to him so you can see how tiny he is. But those are some of those individuals that they've just come out of the pond, they've just lost their tails, they've just become frogs from being a froglet or a tadpole. And then looking at the summary statistics in these conservation opportunity areas, or the Cache River versus Eastern Shawnee, we caught 473 in Cache River and 662 in Eastern Shawnee. But if you remember, that doesn't look like that's that different. It looks like things are going kind of good in Cache River. But if you remember, we had 7 sites in Cache River and only 3 in Eastern Shawnee. So if we actually take the average of what we caught in those areas, it is more like we've caught about 68 per site in Cache River and 221 per site in Eastern Shawnee. So we are still seeing a huge pull of more individuals in the historic Eastern Shawnee sites. But I want to count out Cache River quite yet. We are seeing them there. And as I said, this 4th season that we're in right now, we are seeing a lot more individuals than we have even in past seasons. I call one frog apocalypse back in August when we went out, where I caught 300 individuals when we were out, and most of those were brand new individuals, and they were historic numbers at every single site that we went to. Why that has occurred is something that we're still looking into, but it shows the importance of long-term monitoring. So we are seeing a lot more captures at Cache River Cypress Creek this year than we did in the past 3 years. So it is still doing good over there. And this kind of shows, again, looking at all of those sites, kind of a few of these places, especially in Eastern Shawnee, are really pulling up those numbers for how many frogs we're seeing. So a little fun facts on recaps. So as we mentioned, I had 1,135 total captures of bird voice tree frogs. 430 of those were unique, so you can think of 430 pit tags are out there on specific frogs. And then for unique captures, we had 220 individuals that were caught one or more times. And then 419 were only caught once. We pit tagged them and we never saw them again. And just showing again how well they deal with being pit tagged. One individual, that's their long number that they get. I have caught him 16 times in 3 years, and he has always been caught at the same tree at trap 22. So he really, really likes that site. And yeah, that's his tree. And that's really interesting with him as well, because when I first caught him back in 2021, he was already an adult at that time. So he is in the minimum 4 years old at this point, which is pretty old for a wild tree frog, and we really don't know necessarily how long that they live. So back again to what our expected outcomes were for this project, and kind of still going, is the species status assessment. So the first 3 years of this study were funded by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources on their species SWIG grants. I was Species Wildlife Grants, I forget the name, what SWIG stands for again, but on specific wildlife grants for these endangered and threatened species. That was over in December of 23. We are continuing. I was able to get some funding for travel grants this year, but we are looking for additional funding because ideally we'd love to get 5 years of data out of this to really get a better estimate on updated populations and for demographic information. As I mentioned, there was one site specifically that the first 3 years we never caught a bird voice tree frog there. Now we are catching them there, as well as some other species. So, long-term data is important to be able to see, especially these ebbs and flows when we have these different weather events, we have these massive floods and droughts occurring. How is that affecting these habitats, these species, and being able to have multiple years of data is really important there. And then also seeing, once again, if these could be used as possible bioindicators. More years of data will help with that as well. Kind of this 5 years is what we're really looking for to see how that is doing out there. So future work, as I mentioned, the DNR grant ended in 23. We're seeking additional funding. What we want to continue doing is continue getting more robust population estimates, more in-depth information on their habitat and vegetation, because that might be something that's affecting the numbers that we're seeing as well. Additionally, water quality testing might be something we want to look into with some of these sites that do have these permanent flooding. A lot of times you'll see, even though these sites are way in the forest, way in national forests, and they shouldn't be by anything, the amount of trash that still makes its way during the melts and everything in the spring that gets pushed down, what could be happening with the water quality in these sites. And then we have continued outreach and education. This tree frog project has become really involved in our education department. It's something that we talk about a lot at our outreach events. It's something kids like to hear about frogs a lot, but we like to also get out the importance of wetlands and frogs and why they're important, why people should care. So how can you help? How can you help with this? So we are recently involved with the local RiverWatch chapter. So RiverWatch is a nationally recognized community science program similar to RiverWatch, where we go out and we train individuals, in this case on frogs. We train you on learning to identify local frog calls to help inform researchers such as myself how local populations are doing, but also gives you a better understanding and others a better understanding of the importance of these individuals, the wetlands that they call home, and being able to be an advocate for these species and for their habitats. So stay tuned for spring 2025 when we're going to be having more of those trainings at NGREC and other St. Louis sites. If you are somebody that's listening and you're not in the St. Louis area, as I mentioned, it is a national program. So you just have to look up FrogWatch USA and you'll be able to find where there might be some chapters near you. But we're going through a big revamp this year and how we utilize our training, getting training more involved in classrooms and everything. So it's a really exciting time for FrogWatch and to become involved with that. And I am the co-coordinator as of this year with the St. Louis region. So that's a way that you can be involved and kind of help get the word out about frogs and wetlands and their importance. So my acknowledgements, I want to thank NGREC for all of their support and their funding during this year of the project, as well as Save the Frogs, which I got a travel grant for this year. The Illinois Department of Natural Resources for all their funding and support in the past and continued support. Illinois Natural History Survey, U of I, Lewis and Clark Community College, U.S. Forest Service, and the United States EPA. And then over here we have a nice video of one of the swamps and how peaceful and beautiful they can be when they're full of water and the birds are singing. So does anybody have any questions? And then something else while people have questions as well is we do have a short documentary that we came out with last September that's actually going to be at a film festival this week for the Wildlife Conservation Film Festival. And there's a link to the YouTube here if you were to use that QR code that goes a little bit more in depth about the research, and you'll be able to see a lot more of the visuals to really understand what we're doing. But yeah.
All right, thanks. And you guys should all go watch the video. It's really good.
Thank you. It's 15 minutes, so it's not too long.
There are a couple questions in the chat, so I'll read them out loud so that we get the questions in the recording.
Okay.
So the first question is it true that the sex of some species of frog is influenced by temperature? And if so, could that be happening with these frogs?
So I'm not as familiar with that happening with frogs. However, I do know it happens with turtles, that they're influenced by temperature. I do know some species in the rainforest are able to change sex, but that is a good question if that's something that could happen here. I don't foresee that is occurring. I think it's more that we're just not catching them since we are still getting so many juveniles. So we know that they're breeding. We just don't know where the females are, but they are breeding because we're getting mass amounts of juveniles every single spring coming up. But that is a good question if maybe there's some skewing happening during the temperature changes.
Okay. And then the next question is, do the differences in average captures at the different sites represent a difference in density of frogs in the broader population?
Let me go back to that. So this is just looking at, the Eastern Shawnee, that would be those 3 sites that are in Eastern Shawnee and the 7 sites that are in Cache River, just taking the average of, the populations that we found there, the raw count. So, we have a lot more technical models that we've run. I don't have those represented here for population estimates. It's kind of really just base numbers that we're looking at. But we see something similar with those as well. It's just that there is a lot more frogs in Eastern Shawnee than there are in Cache River. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, and then this question's from Leslie, actually one of the people who helped work on this project.
Hey, Leslie.
Is there any change to the management of the swamps planned? For example, seasonally draining the permanent swamps?
So we just turned in the DNR report for this back in May. So it's still pretty new to them. So there has not been any management changes thus far. And we would hope that, maybe none of those changes would occur until we have a few more years of this data to better inform them. But the DNR has only had their hands on that for a few months thus far. So no management changes have been made as of now.
Okay. And have you put any thought about having like camera traps set up with the traps?
Yeah, that would be, there's actually sorry, I was going back over here.
Mhm.
A study with another individual that I'm kind of working with in northern Wisconsin, where they have camera traps up in the canopies. And they have a lot of tree frogs, so they're finding way high up in the canopies, and they never knew they were that high up. That's part of why I was speculating maybe the females are there. But that could be a good idea, potentially to get some of the camera traps on some of these traps in the future, and also doing maybe something similar to what these individuals are doing and looking up higher in the canopy and seeing if maybe that's where some of the species are at. So
Yeah.
definitely interested in kind of having some additional things added to this project to help better understand what's going on.
Okay, and then are there similar studies from sites in the southern US that can compare to your data that you're collecting?
Yeah, so as far as bird voice tree frogs are concerned, there's not a lot. There's a lot of like auditory or visual surveys. Well, I guess I shouldn't say there's a lot. There's a few auditory and visual surveys from the area, but as I mentioned, that's pretty difficult to know how many individuals you're hearing when you're just listening to the calls. I mean, it is useful like when we do something like Frog Watch, but when we're really trying to get into the nitty-gritty of getting firm population numbers, that's difficult. Um, other studies have been done in Kentucky. They do have a little bit of a population there, but nothing is really in these kind of similar sites of these bald cypress swamps, where they're doing the pit tagging and having them in hand. So there really isn't, they have a pretty narrow, I guess, range. So there just isn't a lot. And the reason why a lot of people didn't study these in the past is people didn't want to go into these swamps. Where really they're beautiful. But I mean, I can see why sometimes people maybe don't want to hike into them. But that's why one of the reasons why there's limited knowledge in some of these swamp habitats is that people just didn't want to get into them.
So since they're state threatened, right? Are
Yes.
they threatened or endangered in any other areas?
They are not, and I'm not I think they might just be, and so they're understudied throughout. If you were to Google these species, like it's very hard to find any information on them. I think the reason why they're not actually listed as threatened in some other places is, is it really that they're threatened, or like in Kentucky, how much of the habitat actually is this bald cypress tupelo swamp? If there's not a lot there and they're doing good kind of where they're at. Um, so that's kind of like one of the things is like there's not a lot of this type of habitat around, so they're not listed as threatened anywhere else. They're only listed as threatened or endangered in the state of Illinois. And that's because of a lot of the degradation of these areas. So it's one of those things where like, okay, maybe we can actually do something about this to improve their populations, or maybe in some of the other areas, like this, what swamps are there, kind of like the swamps that are there, and we can't really do anything to improve it. So that they are only listed as threatened in the state of Illinois, but they're very understudied throughout their range. Not a lot of information on them.
Okay, and then are there water quality parameters that may correlate with your population data?
So right now we haven't got it. We're trying to get out there and do some water quality monitoring, but this year there was massive flooding and then also massive droughts. So there hasn't always been water when we've been going out there to try to sample. Right now we've just been going out with one of our, it's called an EXO unit. And it takes multiple parameters. It takes pH, temperature, connectivity, different algae readings, nitrates, all of that. So we're just gathering all of that right now. We haven't dug into anything like that that might be affecting what we're seeing in the habitat or population. It's just one of those things that while we're out right now, it doesn't take us that long to gather the information. So we're doing it to hopefully then be able to look back at later. But it was difficult this year because we had massive drought events and then massive flooding events. So we actually haven't been able to get that many points of the water quality testing because there just hasn't been water or has been way too
Mhm.
much.
Okay. Does anybody else have any more questions? I had one other question. It's okay if you don't have an actual number for this right now from this
Yeah.
presentation, but what do I know you listed like your numbers for recapture, but what do your recapture rates look like? Like what percentage when you go out to a site?
Yeah, anecdotally.
Hmm.
But once again, this year is kind of crazy. So in the past, I would say In springs and in falls, I mean, it was kind of close to 50%. Really anecdotally, not a firm number there, but it would be like half of the frogs we were getting, they were recaptures. So what we do when we have recaptures, we just measure them and weigh them again. We see what trap we took them from. This year, however, we did have a large, that frog apocalypse. We went out and there was like 300 frogs, and those were all new and they weren't recaptures. However, now we're getting back again the last few times we've gone out where it is starting to be like kind of 50-50 that we're getting. And that might just be natural booms or busts that happen in natural population cycles that we see. Or could it be something where during these massive flood events we had earlier in the spring or recently that it like pushed down other frogs into the area? But we do have a lot of recaptures that we see in the areas. And we'll have ones year after year that we're catching as well. So we have some that we pit tagged them when they were juveniles. They're adults now, or like that one I mentioned that we caught like 16 times in the first 3 years, and he was an adult when we caught them, and we're still catching him now. So they are significant. There's back when this happened, there's 419 that were captured only once and then never captured again. Out of 1,135. So, so it's pretty good.
And you mentioned that at some point they're probably eventually going to shed their pit tags. So how many years can you get out of the study before your first frogs lose their pit tags?
We don't know. There isn't actually information on that. So I mean, like we'll be out there and like we know when they're shedding their skin because it kind of comes off like snot. It doesn't come off like when a snake or something sheds its skin. Yeah, we don't really have information on one, how long these pit tags last for, or two, how long they'll last in the frogs. So that's something that'll kind of be a cool like methodological thing later on, because that was one of the things that we were thinking about when we caught these 300 frogs. We're like, well, that wouldn't make sense because it would literally be that all of them failed at the same time and all of them shedded them at the same time, and you can still tell like when we get a frog, it's not like there is a pit tag in there and it failed, because we can feel a little bit and we can feel if it's in there or not. So thus far they seem to be working. Hopefully they'll work for 5 years. That's a good question, but it's not something that's really known.
Okay. All right. Does anybody else have any more questions? All right. Well, Jess's email is her username right now. So if you want to contact her.
Yeah, I can put it into the chat as well if everybody. Yeah, and if anybody is interested in RiverWatch, it's gonna be super fun. And if you would like to join, and if you're, like I said, if you're not in the St. Louis or greater St. Louis area, it is a national program. So if you just look up RiverWatch USA, which I can link as well real quick, that you can find that elsewhere as well. I'll link RiverWatch St. Louis and then also RiverWatch USA real quick.
Okay, and while you're doing that, our next speaker series is, I think, next Tuesday, October 29th. It will be Dusty, and I don't know how to say his last name, Swedberg, I'm going to go with, Dusty Swedberg from the Illinois Natural History Survey, and he's going to be talking about conservation and diversity of crayfish in the Midwest. So hopefully some of you can make it back for that presentation as well. And thank you again, Jess, for the presentation. It was really good. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And this will be uploaded onto YouTube eventually.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.